Hello everyone, this is CJ with Cycletron. Today I'll be talking about what makes a good beginner motorcycle. This is my son H here. He's standing in front of his brother Z125. My son this son started out on this Yamaha Virago 1982 750. We bought it in December, and over the month of December we restored it, got it in good working order. And about the same time my youngest son got this bike. So when my son got his learner's permit in January, depending on the style of riding and how far we were going, I had him switch between bikes. Neither bike has ABS. This older bike, of course, has drum style brakes. Suspension's a little loose, as you'd expect from an 80s era motorcycle, but it taught him to be very, very careful and respectful of what a motorcycle can do in terms of both power and braking. So in my experience, I've had experience with starting out on a 535 twin, then a 920 twin, then a 750 inline 4. That's kind of the progression I went. Why don't you describe how it was for you between the two bikes?
Well, the problem I had with this bike was, the gas tank, it has weird angles, so my knee, was digging up the inside of it, and, the handlebars are, way too short, so it's hard to maneuver around corners. Tighter angles is difficult for me, on this bike, but that Virago, about right for me when I was starting out. Handlebars are pretty much at the perfect positioning where it's easy to do tight maneuvers, and I felt comfortable with it. It's not like, on my Vulcan.
Well, let's get to the Vulcan here in a second.
Okay.
So really, this was Z125. After he got his permit, he only rode it on the street for about 2 weeks, and then he went exclusively to the Virago. And one of the things I noticed with the Virago is he had much more visibility on the road. It's a bigger footprint on the road compared to the Z125. I'd say if you're a youngster, say a young teenager, and you could ride in parking lots for a few years and are patient to do that, the Z125 would be the way to go. But if you're going to start out riding on the street and you don't have any prior experience, I would recommend a bigger bike. I think if my son had not had his previous dirt bike experience, I wouldn't have started him off on a 750, but he was able to handle it quite well. And after several months of riding this, we decided to get him something more modern with anti-lock brakes, modern suspension. Why don't you talk about this bike?
Yeah. So
this is a 2020 Kawasaki 650 Vulcan ABS Cafe. That's a mouthful, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the power difference was, I think dropping down to displacement would, it'd feel a little bit different, but it has a lot more power than the Virago. On a highway, no problem passing people, where, the Virago, it would, take a bit to get up to speed. So going around semi-trucks, I'd hang out in their blind spot for a bit while I'm trying to get up to speed passing them, where, this one, no problems at all.
Well, the other thing is, this Virago, even though we got it in running orders in a pretty short amount of time, we did have some issues with the starter relay that went out. And, I have some experience working on bikes and working on cars, so I was able to get him back on the road without too much effort and without spending a lot of money. I mean, we bought this bike in pretty rough shape for $1,300, and then we spent another probably $400 getting it in good running order, and he painted the bike himself. But I'd say if you're starting out and you don't have a lot of mechanical experience, and you don't have somebody close to you with such experience, I wouldn't get an older bike, because you might get frustrated with if something goes wrong with it, it breaks. If you don't have the ability to fix it or the funds to fix it, it's just gonna keep you sidelined instead of out riding. And again, I'm a big advocate of having modern features, modern performance features like anti-lock brakes and good suspension. He did put aftermarket exhaust on here, which really changed the character of the bike for the better, but also made him much more, people around him much more aware that he was in traffic next to him. The stock exhaust here was way too quiet. So I think this is an excellent starter bike, but the other thing is, I mean, this was an $8,000 motorcycle. So you got to figure out your budget. And I would actually go for a bike that's a little bit cheaper than your wish list bike to allow room for buying gear. I mean, he's probably got $1,500 in gear here, but he's got really sturdy riding boots. He's got a showy helmet. He's got a reflective vest. He's got a back and chest protector. Purpose-built riding jeans with Kevlar. And you've got riding gloves here somewhere.
Yeah, it's in my helmet.
Well, your gloves in your helmet. So definitely don't skimp on the safety gear in terms of what I would recommend. Because if you go down and get a lot of road rash or worse, it's probably going to put you off riding a bike forever. I mean, I've been down on bikes a couple of times, but I had enough gear where I just had a few bruises and that was the end of it. If it had been worse, it might have been enough to make me sell my bike and never get another bike. So I'm a big fan of beginning riders starting out on relatively low to mid displacement twin cylinder bikes. This is a parallel twin. Another common configuration is a V-twin. I wouldn't get on an inline four. A 250 twin is a good bike to start out on if you have no prior riding experience. The thing about starting out on a 750 is once you get about 1,000 miles under your belt, you're going to get bored with the bike and want to sell it. You're going to want to try and get on the highway more, take longer distance trips. And the 250 is just a little too limited in that regard. But if you're going to stay in the city, you could stay on that 250 for quite a while before maybe moving up to something like this. I hesitate to call this a good beginner bike because it does have the 650 Ninja engine in it. And so it's quite peppy. And either if you don't have the willpower to resist the temptation of going too fast before you have enough experience to really handle it, or at low speeds maneuvers, accidentally getting too hard on the throttle, it could bite you. So I really am an advocate of starting out in between 300 and 500 on the displacement.
Well, I mean, I'd say for the 750, since it's just so low power and it's an older bike, it doesn't have that power where it gets away from you.
That's true.
Whereas the 650, even though it'd be good for a beginner bike, if something happens, it's going to get away from you.
Yeah, that's true. You know, this older bike, this 750, probably has 45 to 50 horsepower tops. And this bike with the aftermarket exhaust is probably low 60s. So it's got, 20% more horsepower than the old 750. Now here's another bike that we picked up through a Copart salvage auction. It's a 600 inline 4. From a budget standpoint, it would make a good beginner bike, and it's relatively new. It's a 2005, but I don't know. This bike produces upwards of 80 horsepower, and I think that's a bit much for a beginner.
Well, I mean, I say for a beginner bike, a sport bike, riding style wouldn't be the one that you want as a beginner rider. I say as a beginner rider, get something like a 250 cruiser or something like that if you have no experience. Just because, you're in a pretty aggressive, seating style on a sport bike.
Well, that's the other thing. You can get an R3, a fully faired bike, but as a beginner, I'd recommend getting either a naked or cruiser style bike, because if you drop it, it's going to tend to do a lot less damage than if you dropped a fully faired bike. And we got a couple other bikes here. This is my 2019 Harley Davidson Street Glide Special. This is not a beginner bike. I know there are people who actually start out on riding with these big touring bikes, but it weighs 830 pounds, and that's a lot to handle. And one of the things that beginner riders really need to get under control and get experience with is the clutch, throttle, braking, and especially at low speed maneuver. And so, of course, most of your braking comes from the front brake, except at low speeds. If you have your handlebars turned on this bike and you get too hard on the front brakes, you're going to drive the bike over. It's gonna lever itself right over on its side. So, you know, it also, as a heavier bike, may be a lot more work. You know, unless you're going to be starting out riding a lot of long distance rides, I'd recommend this as a bike once you have several years of experience under your belt.